Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Pep Talk, the persuasive evangelism podcast from Solas. I'm Gavin Matthews, and every fortnight we're on here and we're talking about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with the world that needs him. Now, my partner in crime today is Simon Wenham, joining us from the other end of the UK. Simon, how are you?
Very well, thanks. It's lovely to be here, and I'm very excited about today's guest. We've done very well to get him on the show, so I'm excited.
It's been a struggle, but the budget stretched. We are welcoming our director at Solas, Andy Bannister, onto the show today. Andy, how are you?
I am doing really well, Gavin, and very weird actually to be on kind of this side of the conversation. Normally, I'm used to co-presenting Pep Talk, and here I am as the guest. So I hope I don't feel the pressure to ask myself questions.
No, do feel free. But you're just back from North America, aren't you? Just back in the UK, ready to speak to us today.
I'm indeed. So yeah, we had an amazing opportunity as a family. Solas very kindly gave me a sabbatical. It's been 15 years of itinerant ministry without a break. So yeah, we went to North America. We lived in North America for 6 years. Canada was home for 6 years, so we weren't able to go back and see lots of old friends and family, show the kids where they were born, and then just do also some speaking across the country. And then the highlight was going and seeing 12 national parks, lots of historical sites, and sort of crisscrossing North America, both the USA and Canada. So an amazing trip. And so that's why all listeners can't see it. I'm sporting a sort of very un-British suntan at the moment.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. I can sort of vouch for that anyway. Yes, your suntan, that is. But it's great to have you back with us. We're featuring today a very special milestone, which is the book, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, which Andy is actually holding up at the moment. And this is the 10th anniversary edition, and it's also been translated in a number of languages too. We'd love just to say a little bit, hear from you a little bit more about why you wrote the book. I suppose it would be helpful just to go back in the past. So obviously it's been 10 years since you wrote the book. Can you say a little bit about why you chose to write the book and what the cultural climate was at that point?
So yes, if we have some sort of timey-wimey sound effects, I think ourselves back to 2014 when the world was young. And so basically when I wrote the book back in the mid 2010s, we were still at the height, Simon, of the so-called New Atheism. That was the label that had been coined to describe people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Chris Hitchens. There were others who had really taken atheism from an obscure, sort of slightly nerdy kind of basement obsession to the mainstream. They had written books that were selling millions of copies. They were on chat shows. They were all over the internet. Suddenly, atheism was cool and hip and trendy. There was even atheist adverts on the side of buses, and Christians for some time were on a bit of a back foot, really, because suddenly we were faced with this, sort of tidal wave of skepticism, very trendy, very hip, very zeitgeisty kind of skepticism. And I watched that happening, and I particularly watched Christians writing really good responses. There were great books coming out responding to new atheism, but something for me felt missing. And I think what I felt was missing was that the reason that the new atheism worked is the arguments were terrible, and we may come to some of that, but the writing was brilliant. Dawkins can spin a paragraph. He's a very gifted wordsmith. And I found myself thinking, we're making a mistake here as Christians, and that we're trying to respond to style and presentation purely with argument. Now, you need to use argument, of course you do. But actually, the reason those books were doing well is they were zippy and they were energetic and they were fun to read. So I thought, I wonder whether it's possible to write a response to the new atheism that tries to respond partly in kind, that yes, it's got some content and some substance, but actually uses, in my case, my style is kind of humor and wit and a bit of sparkle to try to get people who were not Christians to actually read a Christian response to the new atheism. And so that was the birth of The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. And I was kind of amazed that it kind of worked. Really, it was the first time I tried writing a book, and amazingly, I think the first edition of the book did something like about 20,000, 25,000 copies. It kind of took off and got into places where other books didn't. And I say in the sort of closing notes to this updated edition, I'm most excited, Simon, that over the years, the emails I've had from people who wrote to tell me they were able to give that book to atheist friends and family, that no other book seemed to do it. And that, to me, warmed my heart. That was the purpose, and I'm excited to some extent it succeeded. I hope.
And 10 years have gone past and we've all changed. We're all looking a bit older and a bit grayer than we did in 2014.
You speak for yourself, but that's fine.
I'm freely speaking for myself. I'm kind of assuming that the same is true of you. The atheism, though, how has atheism changed in 10 years? How does the atheist landscape look different? I'm thinking particularly, I suppose, about the demographic. You get the impression that atheists tend to be old, middle-aged men, and there's more atheism than you get if you've got a bunch of students. Is that right? And then how do we respond to that?
Absolutely. I mean, that was always the case, actually. The new atheism was predominantly a male movement. I mean, look at the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism that I named a moment ago. You know, Dennett, Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens. They're all men. There were some women kicking around, but not nearly as many, and were not making the impact that the guys were. And then sort of, you would go to atheist conventions and you'd look around the room and go, yeah, there is definitely a lot more men in this room. There's a whole series of reasons why that is and stuff being written about it. What's changed, though, in 10 years, I would say, is this: the new atheism is dead. You know, if you're any Monty Python fans, it's like the parrot. It is no more. It has gone down the curtains and climbed up the curtains and joined the choir celestial. It's an X movement. Practically, that's in some cases, some of its proponents died. So Chris Hitchens was the first of the new atheists to die. Daniel Dennett died, I think, last year. So Daniel and Christopher are now doing empirical research into the God question. Sam Harris has sort of gone full-fat Buddhist almost. He's become a mindfulness podcaster and writing books on spirituality, and actually winding up some of his former fans who think that he's a bit too, religion adjacent. And then Dawkins went through this phase of winding up everybody. So he moved from winding up Christians to tweeting things about Down syndrome and politically incorrect things on gender identity. And he got his Humanists of the Ward Year Award removed by a big secular organization. So he went through that phase, and now he's come out the other side, and he's now declared he's a cultural Christian. And although he doesn't think Christianity is true, he deeply appreciates it. He thinks it's added lots to society and would hate to see a society without it. So that's happened. And then, as you describe, what's happened is a younger generation have emerged who I think have looked at the new atheism and gone, yeah, you're a bunch of old granddads, actually. And actually, it turns out if you remove God, you don't solve some of the big problems out there. And then big problems hit, didn't they? We had COVID, we had financial crashes, we had war in the Middle East and Ukraine, chaos everywhere, and atheism offered no answers. And now scroll forward to the current generation, Gavin. You've got some surveys have suggested that, particularly here in the UK and Europe, but I saw this in Canada and the USA too, that Gen Z, so those are the guys born between 1997 and 2006, I think that's the range. They are, according to some studies, the most spiritual generation we've had for a long time. They don't identify as atheists. They're not all identifying as Christian. They're identifying as spiritual, but not religious. They're asking religious questions. They're trying church out. 21% of young men in the UK now attend church once a month, which is an astonishing statistic. The Bible Society put out a thing called the Quiet Revival, report called the Quiet Revival a few months ago, digging into this trend. In fact, we had one of the authors of that on the Pep Talk podcast. So there's a lot going on. Now, the questions that the new atheism raised and some of the arguments, they're still around. So as Christians, we need to engage with those, but boy, has the landscape changed.
Thank you. I suppose that then begs the question of if new atheism is a busted flush, or at least the sort of main proponents are no longer with us, how, as Christians, do we distinguish between those kinds of Christians and their kinds of arguments and perhaps a sort of new form of atheism that many more people might hold today, whether or not they would call it atheism?
Well, I think a couple of things are going on there, aren't they, Simon? And one thing that I think illustrates that trend, if you take one of the most influential kind of atheists today, take Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic, who you can find on YouTube. He's gone from a few years ago, spitting, just venom at religion, actually, to now saying quite nice things about it. He doesn't believe it, but he's very positive, and he's very, open about the fact that he thinks that actually we need to answer the meaning questions and other kind of things. So that journey that he's been on is interesting. So I'd say a couple of things. If we're engaging older folks, by which older I mean sort of 35 to 40 and above, Gavin, you touched at this, hinted at this. You may still find people who are like, oh yeah, the new atheism. And we need to be ready to say, okay, let's talk about that a little bit. And, knowing the story of what happened and why that movement collapsed, as we cover in the book, I think is quite helpful. Then you'll come across people who will parrot for you some of the new atheist questions. So you might, I come across younger people who might be quite open to spirituality, but say, well, hang on, Christianity, just a minute, hasn't religion been the cause of all these wars and terrible atrocities and so on? Well, that's the old Dawkins argument, just repackaged in a nicer way. So being able to go, yeah, that's interesting, tell me more about that. Let's talk about that. And being able to engage, I think, can be really, really important. And then I think also for those who are spiritually searching, being able, Simon, to say, but why Christianity? Why Jesus? If you're a person who wants to think of yourself as spiritual, a lot of people are tempted to go, well, I can just pick anything from the landscape. Maybe I'll go and listen to a Sam Harris podcast and dabble in Buddhism. Why should they take Christianity seriously? Why take Jesus seriously? And so I think the chapters in the book that I've got on those kind of questions, I think as I updated them and rewrote them, I thought that's an ever important question as well.
We hope that you're enjoying this episode of Pep Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast. We're talking about Andy Bannister's new book, the 10th anniversary edition of The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. You can get hold of a copy of that book if you sign up to support SOLAS for as little as £4 a month, supporting this podcast and our work in evangelism all around the country. If you go to our website, SOLAS, that's SOLAS-CPC.org. The bottom right corner, there's a button that says donate. If you click there and sign up to support us from as little as £4 a month, we will send you a brand new copy of The Atheist Who Didn't Exist by Andy Bannister. Thank you for listening, and now back to the program. So it was a major rewrite of the book then in the light of the changed landscape. And how much did you have to actually change and adjust? What's different in round two?
Well, it was interesting. I was commenting to some of you guys earlier this morning. If you just compare the thickness of the two books, you can't see this watching this, going, why am I doing visual illustration on an audio-only podcast? It is about 20%, 25% thicker. So, yeah, and practically speaking, what we did when we did the update was there's a whole new foreword on there written by a wonderful guy called Andy Kind, who I think, by the way, was our first ever guest on the first ever Pep Talk, who's a Christian comedian and evangelist, and so that was great because he's a Christian communicator, and so he kind of frames the book helpfully. Then there's a new chapter looking at what happened to the new atheism, why did it fail, and we asked that question not to get smug and go, haha, it went wrong. I think the reasons it went wrong are really compelling, actually, when we're talking with friends who may be older and or have been impressed in the past by Dawkins or whatever, to go, why did that movement fail? I think it failed for some really spiritually significant reasons. There's a massive new chapter at the end looking about this new cultural moment we're in. What's going on spiritually? Some have called it a quiet revival. Some have called it a surprising rebirth in belief in God. So we explore those trends. And I think for those readers who are not Christian, hopefully it helped them go, maybe I should think about some things. And for those who are Christian, hopefully it will help you think about how to help your friends think about some things. And then everything in between there, Gavin, has been updated, revised. The jokes have been made 14% funnier, new illustrations. And the other thing we did is update it with people who've written on atheism kind of since the last book. And actually, to me, one of the big finds, who I didn't include last time, there's a wonderful, if that's the right word, American atheist philosopher called Alex Rosenberg, who wrote a book just around the time the last edition of my book came out, called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And it was interesting. Christian reviewers said Alex has accidentally written the best apologetic for atheism in a long time because it's so bleak. He is not afraid. Dawkins and the other new atheists, I think, tried to have their cake and eat it and say you can throw God out, but you can still have meaning and happiness and morality and rainbows and unicorns and kittens. And here's Alex coming and going, no, there's no meaning. No, there's no truth. No, nothing matters. Everything is rubbish. It's all dark despair. And so Alex is a brilliant find. So I engage with him a bit in the book. And he's helpful for Christians. And to have those kind of quotes to hand in a book like this one, when you're talking to friends down the pub or at work, wherever, to say, hey, I read this atheist who said, and then just drop a little bit of Alex on them and go, what do you think? And when they probably go to you, man, that's bleak. So go, yeah, I agree with you. Why do you think it's bleak? And you're away.
Well, one thing, you have perhaps produced an antidote to that, because obviously the book itself is designed to be humorous. I found it very, very funny, I must say. I'm one of these people that I look with a bit of cynicism when I see someone laughing away reading a book, say on a train or something. But this really, really was good. And some of the titles reflect that. You have the postmodern penguin. That was my personal favourite chapter. The Loch Ness Monster's moustache. The aardvark in the artichokes. And you also say, yes, it's I think it's 17.2% funnier than
it
the
changes every
previous
time,
edition.
as you know. 19% of statistics are made up on the spot.
Absolutely. And so I suppose my question there is, I know this is a way of engaging, but what would you say to someone who would say, that might make the argument seem a bit more lightweight? You're just there to entertain. And, if some people see humor in that sort of light. What would you say in response to that?
Well, it's interesting that the little pushback I got on that last time was from Christians, actually, not from atheist friends, because Christians, sometimes we can be too serious-minded for our own good. A couple of thoughts there. Firstly, the motivation to use humor in the book came from actually C.S. Lewis. So I came across an essay by C.S. Lewis from years ago, where he talked about the fact he uses his illustration where he says, he realized that the front door to people's minds are often guarded, as he's put it, by watchful dragons who won't let truth get through the front door. And we've all had experiences, many Christians have had experiences with friends like that. You try and share something and no, you literally can't get a look in. But Lewis said, I began to wonder whether by using story, and then he went on, obviously, to write the Narnia books and so on, whether using story, I could tiptoe past the watchful dragons and sneak the truth in. And I think he succeeded very powerfully. And I read that thinking, I can't write story. I'm not a storyteller, really, not a fiction writer anyway. But I am funny, I think, at least half the time, I hope. And I found myself thinking, I wonder if you can tickle the dragon under the nose, and while it's rolling on the floor laughing, you can just charge through the front door with the truth rather than through the side door. And the serious point behind that is I think humor does allow you to get people thinking about things they wouldn't otherwise. That's true whether it's political satire. Sometimes a cartoonist in a newspaper, whether it's like Matt in the Daily Telegraph or Steve Bell in The Guardian, sometimes you make a point by a cartoon that gets people laughing and you get your point across. Because the people's defenses go down. And I hope what I've managed in the book is to get people laughing, and then while the laughing is happening, the serious point goes through. And by the way, that's where the footnotes come in, because there are funny footnotes and comedy footnotes, because Terry Pratchett was a big influence on me, and Terry liked a comedy footnote. But also there's very serious stuff in there as well. Each chapter ends with recommended reading. So, if you want to go deeper into any of the arguments, there's pathways to do that. But then the other thing I'd say to Christians who, raise an eyebrow, the humor, I go, we forget that Jesus was a humorist. We've missed this because we've become so used to the Gospels and reading them in a dry, fusty way sometimes. We miss the fact that lines like, a camel through the eye of a needle, was supposed to be funny. The first crowds who heard that would have rolled on the floor laughing because they're going, that's a ludicrous image, or straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Jesus was actually the king of the one-liner because he, as a communicator trying to get to the heart of people, realized and knew that story, number one, and then humor, number two, is a way of doing that. So as long as we don't ignore the serious truth, you want within the, as it were, take the, to use an image from confectionery, Ferrero Rocher, right? You've got the chocolatey shell on the outside, which is the humor in the story, but inside you've got the hazelnut of truth. And sometimes people won't take the hazelnut of truth. My kids certainly won't. But if you wrap it in chocolate and sugarcoat it, people will take the nut of truth because you've coated it in metaphor and analogy and humor.
I wonder if the humour is also a good way of engaging some of the folks that I meet who are maybe not sort of in the new atheist groove of like fully card-carrying, signed-up humanist or atheist, but they're functionally atheists. They might not be kind of card-carrying, virulent, in-your-face atheists, but they live as if there's no God. And as if it was all, theoretical and irrelevant to their daily lives. I wonder if humour is a way of engaging some of those people who aren't as militant as some of the folks we met 10 years ago, but, as I say, functional atheists.
I think you're right, Gavin. And I think as well, story works powerfully there too. And for people who didn't read the first edition of the book, which on the one hand, I want to say, where are you? But on the other hand, that's great because that's all the more reason to buy the second edition in paperback, ebook, or in due course audiobook, available from all good bookstores and bad ones too. The primary way I use in the book, as you'll know, Gavin, is each chapter starts with a funny story and a funny illustration designed to A, get you laughing, and B, sometimes, yes, you need to laugh, but sometimes you need to see the issue in a new way. And so, like Simon, you mentioned earlier, the penguin chapter. That's one of my favorite chapters too. And in that book, in that chapter, we're exploring the question of meaning. And the reality is, if you don't believe in God, life has no meaning. It simply doesn't. Just an accident. Now, you just use that as an argument to people. Sometimes people won't take it, or they can't see it, or whatever. But you skew it sideways, and you create a character of a little penguin on an ice floe kind of somewhere, who's surrounded by other penguins and guano and freezing temperatures, telling you, of course my life can have meaning, of course it can, just before they get eaten by a passing killer whale and they discover the universe is quite harsh suddenly. Suddenly I think you can go, oh gosh, hang on a minute, yeah, I am a bit like the penguin, actually, protesting, shouting into the wind that life can have meaning just before the universe drops a rock on me, or runs me over with the number 73 bus to Peckham. And so sometimes I think you're right, Gavin. If we can come sideways at it and make people see things in a new way, then suddenly there can be an eye-opening moment. Sometimes as Christians, we can be a little too quick to reduce everything to a soundbite or an argument, which, by the way, is what the New Atheists did. And sometimes we can just be patient and draw the camera lens back slightly and go, hey, think about this story. And now, having thought about that story and seen how daft the argument looks inside the world of the story, now do you see what happens if you take the argument out of the story and try and use it in the real world? What happens?
That brings me nicely on to my next question, which is, you mentioned the dangers of argument by soundbite, the sort of these kind of catchy slogans or just very simplistic arguments, and how they don't, carry the weight that they seem to. They maybe sound nice, but don't have that kind of intellectual gravity behind them. I suppose I'm interested to know, do you think that's more of a problem now in our age of sort of short videos and social media? And how do Christians avoid that when we're trying to communicate back at people?
Oh, my word. I think yes, and I feel guilty, right? Because I'm someone who spends some of their time on social media. I'm down with the kids on TikTok doing 60-second videos, and I often come away going, "Struth." I mean, that was 60 seconds. You barely got started before you've come to an end. So yeah, I think there is a danger, and I think the danger is that the biggest danger with sound bites is that you caricature. That's, I think, by far one of the dangers. You misrepresent your opponent. And Christians got upset when atheists did it to us. The new atheist movement did this in spades. Dawkins was notorious for, I think, throwing out sound bites like "religion is the root of all evil," which is demonstrably, statistically, historically, utterly inept. But it looks good on Twitter. The danger is, as Christians, you respond kind of the other way, and you come up with some cleverly, reductionistic tweet about atheism to make atheism look inept and stupid and ridiculous. I think the question for me is then, how do we use those formats? How do we make sure we're present on social media? How do we make sure we're engaging in the conversation? By the way, whether you're listening to this, you're a Christian or you're an atheist who stumbled across this podcast. But then how do we find ways to be perhaps a bit nuanced, to be willing to go, hey, here's something to think about, but maybe it's not the whole of the answer, or maybe here's a link to a bigger version of the argument, or maybe just being willing sometimes to just say to somebody, hey, you got a good point, actually. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So I think that's the problem. Social media tends to cause us to simplify and caricature. And by the way, sound bites and social media, where the sound biting often goes on, I think the other danger, Simon, is it can cause us to see the other people as things rather than people. It's very easy to be very, very, very rude to somebody and very dismissive to somebody on, say, X or on, TikTok in a comment that you wouldn't dream of doing in person. So I think for Christians particularly, who are called to love our enemy, and if our enemy is the person who opposes us online, how do we model the fact that we should be treating them as, people made in the image of God, even while their arguments may annoy us? And so I think constantly reminding yourself, I'm talking to a human being here, not just a thing, is a great start.
Absolutely. So the 10th anniversary edition, the all new singing, dancing, and laughing edition.
I'm not
of
sure
the
it sings and
Atheist.
dances, but it does look good on a
Is it
bookshelf.
not?
So yeah,
It doesn't exist. Is coming out. When does it get released? Which countries is it being released in? And how could people get their grubby hands on an actual copy of it?
Well, yes, it comes out on the 17th of July, and of course, this podcast is after the 17th of July. Then it's out. It comes out in the UK on the 17th of July, and then a little bit later in the USA and Canada, later into the summer. It's coming out in paperback and ebook at first, and then at the end of July, I'm recording the audiobook. So for the people who I had so many messages after the first one going, "Where's the audiobook? We've heard you, and we're doing one." So you can get it from any good bookstore, or I'd recommend go to the Solas kind of website or my website, andybannister.net, and you'll find links to places you can get it. The best place to get it, by the way, if you've got the paperback, is 10 of those, who are a wonderful Christian publisher. They're like the Christian Amazon. You know, Jeff Bezos has sold enough books to have expensive weddings in Venice and get himself into space. Support a smaller publisher. Or if you're a Christian listening to this and you don't already support the work of Solas, encourage you to come to the Solas website, sign up as a donor for £4 a month, and we will send you a copy as a gift. And then I would say, by the way, please don't then hold on to the book. Read it and think about who can I give it to.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. And I must add my own personal endorsement as well. It genuinely was one of my favourite books when I read it 10 years ago, and it's still very relevant today. And one thing that really struck me is actually when I first read it, I remember thinking I was reading it with a sort of educating myself, being entertained hat. But the thing that really struck me this time around is that actually I think I could give this book easily to some of my atheist friends who would not read any other type of Christian literature. And that's because it has the humour and the argument. So I'd really encourage people to read the book for themselves and think about who they might give it to, because it really does have that side of things, which many Christian books obviously would just simply not ever get into the hands of people, or at least they wouldn't read them even if you did give them. So I would just encourage everyone to have a look at it, because it's a great book. But it is now time, I'm afraid, to finish the podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Do tune in again in a couple of weeks for another inspiring guest on the Pep Talk podcast from Solas. And thank you so much again, Andy, for being with us.
It's been great to be on this side of the table, having you guys interview me. So thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much. And it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Gavin.